All right. Today I was going to share a little bit about the project that we have planned. It's called the Community Food Resilience Project, and we're interested in particularly looking at ways in which we can engage in informatics as a group for community food resilience. So I've introduced myself. I run the Agricultural Research Lab, Agricultural Informatics Lab here at Purdue University. On the call also is Juliet Norton. She'll be managing the chat. She's a postdoc in my lab and a close colleague and collaborator. So if you have questions or want to make any comments, please feel free to do so in the chat, and she'll be keeping an eye on that. Because this is a community effort, I also have my husband Sunny Karnani taking notes for us. And so there is a notes document that will be shared with the group, so that way you can take a look at what we've discussed today. And so all of these links will also be shared in the chat, I believe, by Juliet shortly. So like many of you, I think I've been thinking about, given the effects of COVID-19, what's going on in our local food system. In particular, what are the different ways in which we can support coordination and collaboration amongst food producers, but also with consumers within our community. And one of the things that sort of struck me was that there are a variety of different technologies already in place. There are a lot of different efforts already in place, yet somehow there was a bit of a challenge when actually thinking about how to make community food systems work, both right now, but then also when thinking about longer term community food resilience. And so, if I can just summarize this challenge, we can think about it as we want to both ensure long term as well as short term community food resilience. And we need to both understand, design, and develop technology mediated systems to coordinate local production, but also the distribution of fresh produce, meats, and processed foods within a community. And so, to try and to try and kick an effort like this off, I thought it would be most useful to start by having a community call where we have a little discussion among the community of developers, some of whom are here from the gathering of open ag tech community, from researchers, some of whom are from different universities across the place, farmers themselves. Thank you so much for taking time to join us today, as well as all of the different folks who are invested in supporting local food systems, from extension to nonprofits and everybody else in between, even just locavores. And so I'm not going to go through this document in a lot of detail. I have written this so it is available online for you to go through after I've sort of laid out a little bit of what we're thinking right now in terms of the plan for action. So I want to spend most of my time actually on what I'm proposing we should do together. And I'm hoping that that will at least lay the foundation for a discussion on what works, what doesn't, what types of things you might want to get involved with, how you might want to get involved, and trying to think about what the fastest way to next steps is. So if all goes well, 1 week from now, we'll all be collaborating and doing something cool together and trying to be useful. So I started by putting together a brief review of what the technology landscape currently looks like. So again, I won't go through this, but I'll at least just show you a little bit of what it looks like. Mostly to get a sense of what are the current ways in which digital technologies can assist in the mediation of helping consumers and farmers find each other, helping farmers get their inventories online, helping consumers who maybe haven't actually done direct sales with farmers previously find farmers now that they're looking for alternative ways of finding food. And so, in a lot of ways, what we're experiencing right now is, many different people are pivoting to new ways of finding food. And so, it's one of those things where information systems can provide the opportunity for people to find each other a little bit better, just like we have today. So there are four genres of tools that I've sort of roughly classified them under. The first one is really online storefronts. I think there are a lot of different tools out there for online storefronts, but there are sort of two primary challenges that we see. The first one is that some of these tools will actually mostly be tied to a specific payment service with a potential of vendor lock-in. So it is really great because you actually have a point of sales device. But these days, when we're trying to think about different ways for different types of people to be able to access these services, if you're using EBT, you can actually use some of these point of sale services because of the way in which the rules are laid out. On the other hand, if you're already using an information management system to track your inventory, then the effort, the actual sort of work of getting online is no longer just as simple as like pushing your inventory to the internet. It's actually setting up an entire system. And so it's not always a straightforward process, and it can entail a time consuming effort. So I wanted to acknowledge that as sort of both there are opportunities with online storefronts, but also a variety of challenges. Similarly, there are a range of tools for online farmers markets, and I've just gone through a couple of these, and you'll notice that there are some that are Indiana specific, just because I'd originally written this document for a local audience. But so there are lots of different interesting platforms, but each of them do require an invested community of practice of people who are interested in actually doing the coordination on the ground. Some of them will require fairly intense setup, which requires either technical support or the technical know-how to set up a server, set up an actual tool on the server to then aggregate different kinds of farms together. And so there are both opportunities and challenges with these online farmers markets. Um, there are also a range of farm directories that are available, which, at least for me, have always proven to be super helpful as a starting point. But these aren't necessarily ways for you to dynamically manage sort of participants and services and products, right? They're just a way to connect point A and B. And so, while a useful starting point, they don't always necessarily provide you with the type of functionality that you're looking for. And we all know social media has been a big hit in the farming community. Many farms already maintain a presence in social media, and while there are some e-commerce capabilities, they're not necessarily very well suited to the actual, mediation of purchasing between farmers and consumers. And so there's a little summary table here if you want to come back and look at it later. But at the end of the day, I can summarize the sort of critical questions in this space as twofold. The first being, what do we know are the actual barriers that farmers and consumers are facing in coordinating local food production and distribution? Are some of these social barriers, some of these technical barriers? And if so, how can we enable community food resilience through appropriate digital technologies, stressing on the appropriate, and technology mediated processes, stressing on the mediated? Okay, so with that background, I want to jump into what we're proposing we're going to do. So, our short term goal is to actually design, refine, and assemble a small toolkit that includes both technical infrastructure as well as social infrastructure for farmers and consumers engaged in local coordination of food production and distribution. Our long-term goal is to make sure that these are tools. This is a system that we're designing that actually allows for longer-term community food resilience. So, we want to make sure that whatever we're building doesn't just go away once the pandemic is over, but is something that actually allows for people to move into the community food systems that they've always wanted to engage in, or actually create the types of food hubs and systems that they've always wanted to. And so it's a little bit of lowering the barrier to access to different people, and it's also a little bit of bringing people who are already doing work like this together, because I think it's important for us to acknowledge that there are lots of different folks, and I suspect many of you on the call today are already doing some really interesting things in different pieces of this. And so I'm hoping that we can spend some time today also learning more about what you're doing. So we have 4 objectives, with the first 3 really being focused around short-term goals. So in the first phase of our work, and you can, we've the way in which this has been structured has been to actually have this be a fairly quick process. So each of the first 3 goals actually maps out to about a week's worth of work, which is another one of my open questions. It's a little bit of an ambitious timeline, but I think we're in a time that requires us to act urgently. And so I look forward to your input on that one. So in the first phase, this would be a farmer-focused qualitative study. There would also be a consumer-focused food flow mapping, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on this, the first 2 phases especially. And that will be paired with an evaluation of the tech landscape, somewhat similar to what I had done already, but a lot more in depth. And so we'll do a functional evaluation of tools. In the second phase of work, I hope that we can engage in some participatory design work. So farmer-centered, community-driven design of local food toolkits. And so again, that involves not just tools themselves, but processes, because there are plenty of tools. So we want to make sure that we're also not just reinventing the wheel. And so this is an opportunity for us to also identify appropriate technologies into these toolkits. In the third phase, we would focus on rapid prototyping and community testing of these critical processes and technologies. And so this would involve actually just doing what we have designed in weeks 1 and 2. So this will include both setting up social infrastructure, which is something that I think many of the community organizers on this call are already familiar with, but also setting up the technical infrastructure to make sure that we can have farmers, consumers, community coordinators, and technology stewards able to just get things in motion. And so I'm hoping that within a month we can go from making sure that we have a shared understanding of what the critical roadblocks are through to actually having something that folks can use out in the field. And from there, it would be a refinement process. We would do 2 week sprints. And after that, we would start to think about strategizing longer term community food resilience. If you have any questions again, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I believe Juliet will speak up when there is something that I need to pay attention to. But if there are none at this time, then I will dive into week one. Okay. So in week one, we're proposing a fairly quick qualitative study, and the goal here is to articulate key information challenges faced by small-scale diversified farmers. And I would like to suggest that we focus on the United States just as a way to scope the problem. I also understand that there are site-specific challenges that people face even within the United States. But at least I'm of the impression that a small farmer in peri-urban, northeastern United States is facing more similar challenges to a small farmer right here in the Midwest than necessarily with a much larger system or a distributor or any other type of farmer. And so I'm hoping that by thinking about ways in which people are similar, we can start to think about common types of tools and processes that we can develop for a wide range of people. So in this first part, we would need to, so I have some sampling guidance here that I would like to describe to you. And this is sort of, what the farmer recruitment would entail. And so we're looking for folks who span across different types of cropping systems and for representation in these 3 areas. So we're bucketing them not by state, but in terms of, is this an urban farm, a peri-urban farm, and a rural farm? And so here, what we're really trying to do is get a better sense of how folks are tracking inventory before, now, in the ideal case. How are you finding consumers? How are you pivoting distribution? Trying to get a better sense of what the information and food flows are so that we can then identify critical challenges and bottlenecks in current tools and processes. And so this would be done through a virtual qualitative study that I'll be leading here at Purdue. And so for the researchers on the call, if you'd like to get involved in this part, I'm hoping that, you hit me up as soon as possible so that we can get you in on our early protocols and documents and get you up to speed. But that is actually underway already. So we've already started the design of this particular study and are moving into farmer recruitment hopefully next week. So there are 2 other pieces that will be paired with this qualitative study. The second is a community-driven design approach the second requires us to take a grounded understanding of food pathways within communities. And my work is not in this particular area. And so I put this here as an invitation primarily to folks who are focusing on what community and consumer needs are. Broadly speaking, I was thinking that we would do a virtual mapping based on our community understanding of how individuals, communities, and organizations are finding local food, coordinating logistics, making payments, right? The types of things that I'm hoping we will learn here is, how are people actually trying to find a local farmer to meet their entire plate's worth of needs? I'd love to learn more about existing work and parallel efforts, as well as missing pieces in this particular area. But I trust that with a group as big as ours, that we might be able to at least engage in some initial virtual mapping based on community understanding. And I'll give you a brief example of what that might look like. The third activity, and so these are 3 parallel activities, so I'm sure you can already see that there will be 3 groups that we would break out into. So the third activity is really focused on making sure that we have a much more rigorous understanding of the technology landscape. The write-up that you saw earlier, was something that I had done independently and had not necessarily done it in a very rigorous fashion. It was mostly to just to take a first step at looking at what the tools are. And so after that first preliminary review, I would hope that we would actually do a mapping of the functional capacity of current technologies that will actually allow us to then start to match the needs of farmers and consumers with appropriate technologies. Right. And so I've got a little illustrative sample evaluation here. And so you can see, as you start to think about each of these different tools, it's, what type of functionality can they provide? What kinds of distribution can someone engage in through this particular tool? What types of payment services are actually available? One of the biggest challenges, at least that I've seen so far, is that of EBT and SNAP. And I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that, but I would look forward to hearing from you if you do. I think that might be even just a simple place of one of the things that we might be able to add to this space. Another piece that is particularly important, at least to me, is that trying to think about whether or not these tools are open source. So having an open source tool, and I'm a big proponent of open source software, and I can talk about the Gathering for Open Ag Tech, of which there are members on this call at length, but I will not spend too much time on that. But it is important to have open source software that we can extend as a community. It allows for us to both build things by the people for the people. And at least in my research, one of the values that I try to practice is that publicly funded research should result in both publicly available tools, but also processes that people can then take on and use in their day to day. And so this functional mapping should at least then allow us to start to think about, what do farmers need, what do consumers want, and how do these tools actually allow for the twain to meet? Okay, so from there, now that we will have had an understanding of what the critical challenges are, I would hope that we can then start to get our hands a little bit dirty and start to actually engage in some of that design work that we need to do. And so I have three proposed activities, which I'm not going to read this text. I have a couple of examples, but I'll summarize very quickly. The first is actually to build on any add-on features to existing tools. So if any of the tools that we have found have gaps, then we'll try and make sure that we actually plug those gaps. There is a rich technical community that is interested in supporting the agricultural community. And so I believe there are several on the call who are here and willing to come and help write some code as needed. The second two are actually more the design of processes. So the first would be to actually design a triage process of sorts that will be conducted by a response team to actually be able to, work with a farmer to say, where is your data right now? What are your goals for both distribution? How do you need to pivot, and how quickly do you need to pivot? And then in collaboration with a technology steward, we would actually try and make sure that they go through that process. So getting people online in the span of a day or two, as opposed to in the span of a couple of months. It will depend on what their actual needs are, right? In some cases, if you already have a farm record keeping tool that you're using, like FarmOS, and you are using that for farm management, then perhaps getting to an online shop might be a little bit easier. Where if you were entirely paper-based before and now wanted to get something set up, it might take a little bit more time. Right? But the goal is to try and see if as a community we can come together and help farmers in their time of need to get online and help us all build the community food systems we desire. So that would be paired with the design of the community mobilization process that allows for the aggregation, the creation of community food hubs. I know that there are lots of on the call who probably already work in community food hubs. And so again, this is where I would look to you for your leadership and trying to help us think about how can we actually create a process that then different members of a community can take and run with. And so a lot of this is about coming together, thinking about what you already know, what you already likely do on your own, and how we can turn that into a process that can then be replicated across the country by other engaged citizens who are interested in building their local food systems. So, two more little pieces here. So what do those things look like? So when I'm talking about, things like mapping the community, mapping community needs, one of the ways in which we can express that is through something like a consumer journey map. And so I'm not sure if this is, zoom in a little bit. I realize the font might be a little small. So if you look here at this bottom one, this is actually just again, a very preliminary map that shows how a user goes through the process of doing something. Usually we'll create journey maps and software design for, thinking about how do you order food through an app. In this particular, well, that's exactly what we're doing here. Or, it would be for how do you make a payment through a banking system, right? And so that would be the typical type of consumer journey map that I've at least seen. In this particular case, I'm suggesting that the consumer journey map actually spans even outside of the tool itself and allows for us to think about what is a person's journey from thinking about how do I engage my local food system all the way through to actually trying to get that food and have it delivered. And so in this particular case, in orange, these are good things that are happening or positive things that we can identify that exist during that particular phase. And the red would be challenges that are happening. And so we would start to create some of these to allow us to be able to map out where the bottlenecks are and what the process needs to look like. Similarly, we can use design artifacts like farm personas that would allow us to be able to engage in the design of tools themselves, of the process itself, to allow for different kinds of farms to get online. And so these two are examples of artifacts that would be used in the design of processes and tools for community food resilience. And again, here, I think I mentioned the sample farm, the triage process. This is just a brief example of what that might look like. And again, these are meant to be illustrative. And hopefully, as we go through this process together, we would actually start to articulate what the design of any required tooling is and what the actual pieces look like. And so part of our next steps would involve setting up the technical infrastructure. So I imagine we would have something like a wiki that we can all contribute to. I have a small team that will be driving a lot of the content creation. And so for now, I think we're mostly looking for input, guidance, and trying to get a better sense for how you would all like to get involved. Okay, so that I'm not going to go through objectives 3 and 4 just because they are a little further along and mostly involve building and strategizing, which falls out of these first ones. But I'm just going to pause briefly and see if there are any questions so far.
There haven't been any questions yet in the chat.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next part of this where I'm hoping that we'll actually have a little bit more of a discussion around what we might like to do next. So if I go over here, we've got some notes that have been taken about what's been happening so far. But I have over here a description of the different working groups that we might form after this. And so I was imagining we would have four focus areas. The first would be folks who are interested in focusing more on farmer needs. So this includes farmers who can participate, folks who can help recruit farmers, folks who can provide input on behalf of groups of food system stakeholders, and those types of people. And so after this call, I'll be sending out a sign-up sheet for you to basically be able to say, I want to be able to, I'll help recruit, I'll help with doing some of the community coordination, or, I have no time for these weeks, but I'd like to then be able to help out with user testing. And so that would at least allow for you to sort of pick and choose from each of these different activities what things you actually want to get involved with. The second focus group would be around the community side of things. So this would include community organizers and coordinators, food hub folks, individuals who just want to support this effort, and individuals and organizations who might want to form food hubs. So one of the things that I also wanted to flag here is that you can be a part of multiple different efforts. It really just depends on what your bandwidth is and how much time you want to be able to commit to different types of things. So then the third group would be the tech focus group. And this would be folks who can both write technical documentation, develop tools, but also provide technical support. And so those are those two pieces of the community mobilization and the triage process teams, right? They would be both providing tech support and help to farmers who need to get online, but then also to consumers who might want to actually start to use a particular food hub software. The final group, and I didn't mean to put this in at the end, but that is the research focus. So if you are a researcher on the call, I want to get involved with, the design of the study, data analysis, if you're a designer and want to get involved with some of the human-centered design components, or if you're a writer and just want to help document this process, I invite you to join that as well. And so this is at least my proposal for both, what types of activities we should engage in, or could engage in as a group, as well as a way in which we could come together in different working groups to try and make sure that we can actually achieve some of these things as four concurrent teams. Um, and this is sort of, I think, the long and short of what I wanted to be able to share with you guys today. Um, Next steps will basically involve having you indicate interest in specific activities. So if you're willing to help recruit farmers, for instance, for that first phase, that would be something that you'd indicate. And thank you all for filling in the survey form as well beforehand. That at least provides me some guidance, and a lot of this did come from your indication of the types of things you'd be willing to contribute to. And so, with that, I'd like to pause again for any more questions. Otherwise, I have a couple for the group if you're willing to entertain my questions.
So we have a question in the chat. So far, small scale diversified farms are the ones who are most likely to be using online platforms. Does this project intend to also include larger farms who are selling into wholesale channels and may be unfamiliar with direct to consumer platforms?
Cool. That's a really great question. I don't know as much about that particular type of farm, so I would hope that you'd be able to at least share a bit more about what types of challenges they might have in common with these smaller farms. I'm not sure if you want to speak up and maybe answer right now, or
Hi, this
yes.
is Michael O'Donnell. I can let Gwen chime in on this before I speak if she wants to.
Hi, sorry, I was finding my unmute button. Um, yeah, my name is Gwinnell Engelskirch, and I work for UC, University of California Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Project, UC STARP. We're based in California at UC Davis. And yeah, just kind of anecdotally, I mean, so much of us are just trying to keep up with um, how the landscape is changing and how the farmers and the food system stakeholders are adapting. And I have just, definitely been aware anecdotally that the smaller scale farms that already had a portion of their sales going direct to consumer have been able to adapt much more quickly
Mhm.
because they sort of had that infrastructure in place to tap into. And the folks that were, you know, selling wholesale into institutions, focused on kind of less diversity in their cropping systems and a larger scale distribution model are the ones that have been particularly challenged. So I'm just curious because if I understood by your framing, it sounded to me like this project was interested in really directing a lot of energy towards the smaller scale diversified farmers.
Yeah, so I think I'm just going to pull up this map again. I think the primary thing that I'm interested in trying to make sure we do is we help make sure that the distribution channels that need to be supported are supported. And so at this stage, we don't actually have a cap on size. It's more about, are you actually trying to find consumers? And so this would be something that I would hope that we can explore a little bit more together. Right now, I had primarily been thinking about small farmers because I hadn't considered necessarily that larger scale farmers who are pivoting from institutions to direct consumers did not have the support that they needed. But if they did not have the technical support that they needed, then I think it would be something that we would have to just discuss as a group. And if that's something that we're down for in this design, we would just make sure that we expand it a little bit more. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I'll follow on that. When I was thinking the exact same thing, this is Michael O'Donnell with Purdue Extension.
Yeah.
Um, um, I think what we would find as we talk about the types of farms that Gwinnell is referring to is this is not just going to be addressed through some of the technological and social infrastructure that we're talking about here, but that we're going to run into the existing challenges with more localized and regional processing infrastructure that could allow some of these larger field crop, rural based type farms to pivot more to local and regional markets.
Mm-hmm.
For example, here in Indiana, you're not going to find a single functioning um, um, grain mill within our state that's oriented to sourcing, working with farmers locally and distributing into local regional supply chains. The closest example would be Janie's Mill in Illinois, the one mill that we did have operating for locally sourced grain and for local markets was very small scale and is currently shuttered. So I think for these small, diversified, direct to market type farms that we're talking about, which is mostly vegetables, some fruits, some pasture based livestock, they may already have some online platforms. And I think that's where assessing these other existing platforms that they're using is important. And they're not necessarily running into these more systemic physical infrastructure limitations that I think the majority of pivoting larger scale, production farms towards is going to be going to have to be a part of the conversation.
Yeah. No, I very much appreciate both your thoughts. And actually, two things come to mind. I think, Michael, in a discussion with you in earlier days, you had also mentioned this idea of trying to make sure that we support the ag of the middle. And so, at least in my mind, I hadn't necessarily sort of constrained it by size. So, field crops are here acknowledging that they are likely going to be large systems. But at the end of the day, I think it was more about, are you interested in trying to connect directly to consumers? And if that's the case, then that's sort of one of those things where some of these tools might be able to help mediate. And so
Yep.
yes, I think the answer should have been yes then. I just sort of had some trouble sort of connecting the dots. The second piece is actually I attended a listening session yesterday that was by a collection of food hubs, and the name is blanking to me right now. But I think there was a discussion there, and something struck me where they were talking about this idea of like, previously when you were trying to think about how to get a jar of tomato sauce to somebody's home, it was they would just go to the grocery store. But now it's not just how do you get that jar of tomato sauce to somebody's home, but how do you get local tomatoes into that jar in the first place? And so that sort of that visual struck me a little bit, and I suspect that that might be some of the links that you're talking about when it comes to also thinking about, where do the processes, local processors fit into this? Where do local farms and local processors also find each other? And that's certainly not something that I had explicitly considered, but I think it's well within the sort of the scope of topics that we're talking about within this. It's hard to portion off a piece of this food system without thinking about the implications of the others, for sure. Any other questions or sort of general thoughts about our proposed project and the process?
If nobody else wants to talk, this is Michael again, and maybe I was a little bit zoned out when you covered this, and I was trying to go back through your website from which you were presenting, but that figure 3, understanding functional capacity of current technologies. You've got Hoosier Harvest Market and Market Wagon and stuff. Yeah, I mean, this effort isn't necessarily looking to get farmers or consumers to pivot off of these existing platforms.
Right.
It's more of, is there a way to better integrate or
well, it's actually
or create a platform that would be separate and that's better, get better capabilities? Or I guess I kind of missed this part of the conversation. I apologize.
No worries, no worries. So my intention is not to recreate any of these existing tools, right? There are lots of different software development efforts that do exist. I think one of the challenges might even be for a grower to be able to identify which one of these best suits their particular needs. So if you are interested in making sure you keep doing your CSA and that you want to make sure that you're visible to among a wide range of farms, so the consumer doesn't have to necessarily come find your website, for instance, then maybe a tool like Hervey might work for you. And so by doing a full functional capacity assessment of the entire technical landscape, we might be able to actually be able to create pathways for farms to go to the right tool first, as opposed to having to try multiple tools. The second piece is, I think many of these tools, and so one of the things that I'm always interested in is trying to think about how do we inform the design of technologies. And so it's not necessarily to say this one doesn't work at all, but to even be able to make recommendations to the developers of these technologies to say, if you're trying to meet this particular type of farmer's needs, these are the types of functionality that you're going to need to make sure you support. And here are some ways in which you might be able to support that. And so some of the outputs of this design work includes being able to make recommendations to both technical developers and then also to farmers about which tools to choose and when. And so that would be part of that triage process, for instance. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's perfect. And I think I mentioned this to you in one of our previous conversations, and I know that this list here in this diagram is not comprehensive, but just
yes,
make sure that Gray's cart
yes,
is on the list. Okay.
Yeah, so I actually started with about 25 tools. This was just a down sample to give you a sense of how one might go about this. And so for this particular group, so one of the tools that I've been using a lot is called Airtable. And so we've been doing a lot of data verification for cover crop data with a wide range of people. And so for this particular effort, we have about 30 cover crop experts across the country going through all of our cover crop data and then providing us with expert opinions on how they work in different regions and where. So one of the other projects I have sort of has resulted in things like this particular cover crop tool, which is definitely under development still. But this would be one way in which we would actually start to map out the functional capacity of each of those tools on the back end, and then be able to provide farmers with basically, a tool recommender system sort of thing.
We have a series of questions in the chat. So first, I would just like to point out that Gwenaëlle had said that the Food Hub conversation that you were talking about briefly is a National Good Food Network hosted by the Wallace Center.
Thank you.
So there you go. And Andrew said that thinking about our recruitment is the idea to speak with people who are already doing some online marketing and build up to identify the missing growers who are not online, both. I think that builds on top of the previous question.
Yeah. So I think I would definitely like to know more about, I'd like to hear from both groups, right? First, from folks who have already managed to make the transition online, who have managed to pivot from distributing to restaurants to now direct to consumers, because they figured something out that worked for them really well. And it's important for us to learn from that process. The second would be to talk to folks who haven't managed to make that jump yet. And so that would at least give us a better sense of, what some of the roadblocks are and what some of the acceleration pathways have been for other groups.
And then we have oh, sorry.
Yes, Andrew.
No, that was great, and I appreciate that. This is Andrew. I'm at Purdue University. I'm an anthropologist, so I'm on the research side of things, and I'm just thinking about this as a research design problem to solve with respect to finding people who you don't know who they are exactly, and what problems they have is obviously a classic kind of issue. And I think that the urban, peri-urban, and rural way is probably a pretty good way to go about this if we can use something like Ag Census data to fill in our missing holes along those buckets. Is that the kind of thing that you were thinking?
So I was thinking a little bit more through the network. And so one of the reasons why I started actually by reaching out to folks at Purdue Extension was even during my work in my dissertation, in graduate school, I found that some of the folks who best understood what farmer needs were folks who are already working with farmers. And so I was hoping to, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why I'm glad that there are lots of folks from different types of extension agencies on the call today, because you are likely already working with people and know some who have managed to make that transition and others who have not. So then from a research design perspective, Andrew, I imagine we could supplement that by doing something like what you're proposing. And so this is one of the reasons why I'm particularly excited to also have you join the team, because it would be helpful to hear about how we can supplement my original, I think, not as rigorous sampling technique with, I think you've briefly described a quota sampling technique to me as well.
Yep, sounds great.
Yep, I'm on board.
Okay, so we have another question from Jamie. What kind of decision-making process do you envision taking place as we go from the broader problem space, which is incredibly vast, to more targeted prototyping phase, which must be highly constrained in scope by factors of time and resources?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. So one of the things that I'm hoping we'll do is, and this is why I want us to start with actually doing some of this qualitative work, is we'll be able to get a better sense of who are having the same issues. So be able to actually engage in a prioritization of different kinds of functionality that we might need to build, different types of processes that we need to design. And so in a lot of ways, it's what we learn in that first week and conversations that we have in these sorts of information sessions that will drive the prioritization of what we actually prototype. The second piece that would actually drive that prioritization is the what's possible in the amount of time that we've set up question, right? And so that's where, Jamie, I would look to folks like you and others within the technical community who are able to give us guidance on, what things should be built quickly or what things can be built quickly, and what are things that we might, even though they're super high priority and everybody wants them, are a pretty big technical lift and might need to be prioritized as something that we do a little later down the line. And so prioritization of functionality and processes to be built will be the summary of that answer.
Cool. Sounds good to me.
Sweet.
Kirsten Serrano, she asked when talking about local processors. Oh, she just stated when talking about local processors, don't forget local restaurants with commercial kitchens.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm hoping that when we're thinking about sort of what different kinds of groups need, I had mentally bucketed restaurants under organizations. I don't know if that's appropriate, but trying to think about how different types of organizations, from schools to local food banks to restaurants, how are they all managing both finding food and also distributing food? I know there's an analogous project that is focused more on food distribution to schools and food banks in California. And so I'm hoping that down the line we can connect up with them to try and then also make sure that, we're not trying to do all of the things all at the same time.
Where do farmers markets fit into the conversation? That's a question from Liz.
Yeah. So this had actually, one of the reasons why I called this genre of tools online farmers markets is because I had been seeing a lot of the way in which the tools are being framed as an alternative to farmers markets in the time of the pandemic, or a supplement to farmers markets. I think if you look at some of the marketing language and at least I think it was maybe with Crave and a couple of the other ones, there is this idea that this is a digital platform that fits onto an existing farmers market. One of the things that I would actually love, and I was planning on reaching out to my local farmers markets at least, but if anyone on the calls would like to bring them into these conversations, I would love to be able to learn a little bit better. How can these tools fit into what farmers markets already provide? I know that right now we're experiencing limited traffic at some of them, and so are there certain types of features that might be better suited for the farmers market use case?
I got a message from someone that is on the call on their phone, but is not on the computer,
Okay.
who happens to have my chat phone number. They asked, or they said, my local farmers are using Instagram to sell products via their social network. How would you suggest to support their transition?
Yeah. I love that question because, at least for me, one of the only reasons I ever joined Instagram was actually to connect with my local farms, because that has been a very popular way of describing or for them to communicate what they're doing. I think Instagram is a great marketing tool. I would like to see if there are ways in which we could pair this marketing tool with tools that actually allow for managing the transaction. And so there is some limited functionality in tools like Facebook and Instagram, but I don't necessarily see them as a replacement for having a tool that would actually help manage the transaction. And hopefully that answers their question.
They said yes. Okay. And for anybody else who would like to text a question, I just provided my phone number.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so we do only have 10 minutes remaining, and so I wanted to at least make sure that I take some time to ask the group to see if there was anything that you're working on that you would like to bring up or describe that you think might fit into this and that we would benefit from learning about. Okay. I suspect that if you want to keep us posted on what you're doing and talk more about how we can connect, it's my email address has been sent out to all of you, and so please feel free to reach out and tell me more about what you're up to, so we can think about ways in which we can not reinvent the wheel and actually work together a little bit better. Okay. So I'm going to just wrap up with some next steps. So you'll get an email after this meeting with a little bit more information on how you can continue to participate. There will be a way for you to opt out of those emails if after hearing all of this, you're like, no, not for me. But so in about a week, we'll have some signups for specific activities. And you, once again, like I mentioned over here, should be able to sign up a la carte. So that way you're not committing to 4 weeks worth of work, but actually just commit to the types of things that you feel like you have bandwidth for and your already busy lives right now. So we will be having another meeting next week. So if you'd like to listen in and see what progress we've made, it'll be on Wednesday, April 22nd at 11 a.m. I'm going to alternate between 11 and 3 p.m. so that way those people who have conflicts can at least still make it. This will all be in the email. And that's pretty much all I have for all of you. The proposal is going to remain online. And so if you'd like to sit and have a read through all of this in your own time and then maybe have a think about how you might want to coordinate, please feel free to do so. I'll be changing the bottom link so that way it's more up to date. We also have a forum post that is ongoing. So if you want to take part in our online discussion, this link will also be posted. And so I had originally posted a brief description of what the project is, and there's a little bit of a discussion that we've been having there on what different options might be moving forward. Okay, and so with that, if there are no more questions.
Got one more quick question. Just if we want to invite other potential partners into this conversation,
Yep.
do you suggest that they still use that same Google form?
Yeah, I'm just going to leave that Google form up just because it's already out into the world and I've already marked who I've invited so far. So please feel free to keep sharing that same form and I'll keep them posted on whatever comes next.
Great. And thanks, Ankita, for everything you're doing, you and Juliet.
Thank you so much all for your time and for your presence. I really appreciate you spending some time with us today and giving us your
Likewise.
and hearing ours. All right. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.